Welcome to Lesson 1 of Biblical Economics 101. In this series, we will be looking at what the Bible teaches about economics and how it applies to how we think and act economically as individuals and in society, and how biblical economic principles apply to every area of life. The topic for Lesson 1 is God owns everything. And this topic specifically looks at the concept of ownership from the biblical lens. The lesson will explain the concept of God's absolute ownership as the foundational principle of Christian economics, describe man's role as a steward or trustee under God's ownership in the context of creation, and identify ownership as the starting point for understanding Christian economic principles derived from the covenant structure of the Bible. So, why is the concept of ownership the first thing we need to understand in biblical economics? This is because the very first verse of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This tells us that God created everything, and that implies that God's creation of everything forms the basis for God's absolute ownership of everything. Therefore, any economic theory must begin with the biblical doctrine of creation if it is to be accurate. This sets biblical economics apart from pretty much every other economic approach out there. Non-Christian economics might start with things like scarcity, the division of labor, or the idea of autonomous man, but biblical economics begins with God. Specifically, it begins with God's absolute ownership. Because God created everything, He is sovereign and therefore He owns everything. As Psalm 24 says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein." Psalm 50 verse 11 also says, "Every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills." This is the doctrine of original ownership. God owns it all, absolutely and completely. This isn't just a theological point. It is the first principle of the biblical covenant. That is, that God is transcendent over creation. This means that there is a clear distinction between God, the Creator, and the rest of His creation. It is one of the fundamental foundations upon which biblical economics rests. This makes ownership theocentric, that is, God-centered, theological, and therefore also ethical. So, if God owns everything, what about us? Do we own anything? This leads us to the concept of delegated ownership. God, the absolute owner, chose to give mankind the job of managing His creation. We are stewards or trustees over His property. This is a subordinate responsibility under God. From the very beginning, God planned to transfer ownership of the world to Adam and Eve. This was part of the dominion covenant described in Genesis 1:26-28, where mankind was to multiply and subdue the earth. This delegated ownership means that any property we possess is essentially a lease from God. Everything we have comes from Him. This delegated ownership forms the foundation of ownership by mankind. It is individual, but is also part of a larger hierarchical system under God's ultimate authority. No one is ultimately autonomous. Our ownership is always accountable to God, and as God's steward, we are responsible to Him for how we use what we have. Adam and Eve were given a preliminary grant of capital, the Garden of Eden, which represented the whole earth. They were expected to manage this, increase its value, and extend their authority under God across the earth. This implies a progressive inheritance over time. Understanding this, that God is the original and absolute owner and we are a steward, is the critical starting point for Christian economics. It is the opposite of humanistic economics, which often begins with the idea of self-ownership by man, completely bypassing God's initial claim. Furthermore, our belief in Trinity, that God is one and the Godhead as three persons, is the foundation of the principle of the one and the many. This Trinitarian belief demonstrates the unity and diversity in the Godhead, and this also has implications for how the Bible views ownership and results in different forms of human ownership. The Bible gives to humanity a model of overlapping ownership. Property is not exclusively and absolutely owned by any single human being or institution. It is neither owned exclusively by the one nor by the many. There are various examples of ownership. We've got individual ownership, family ownership, ownership by associations and corporations, ownership by churches, and by the civil government. Because man has delegated ownership, man also has boundaries that are God-given. In Genesis, the boundary God gave Adam and Eve was that they should not eat of the tree of good and evil. This was the only boundary God explicitly told mankind not to violate. However, Adam and Eve violated it and were ejected out of the garden as a consequence of their action. The fall of man involved the violation of God's property rights, and so the fall, judicially, involved the crime of theft, which is an economic crime. To conclude, creation wasn't just good, it established the fundamental economic reality that God owns everything, and we are entrusted with managing His world as His stewards. This sets the stage for everything that follows. In the next lessons, we'll look at the other aspects of economics in the creation period, such as stewardship, property, imputation, and inheritance, all built on this core principle of God's ownership. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series on biblical economics. See you next time.